delay. So sorry about the new episode of our Mentor Spotlight series, a live conversation to explore the role of mentorship in developing the professional identity of physician. Work is closely connected to his active involvement as in his local community. As a resident of West Baltimore, over the last couple of years, Daniel has contributed to evaluating and addressing barriers to health that are rooted in the built environment. And he also recently started working as assistant professor of medicine and pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His current research is focused on issues related to community health, as well as the intersection of telehealth and medical education. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you.
I'm glad you could join us. I think that one of the things that I find most interesting about your work is how you have been able to combine, your role as a clinician, but also this work that has to do with public health, and I think that's something that we should do as doctors. But today we want to explore something different, and I think inspire you to pursue a career in medicine.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So first, thank you for the kind introduction and for just inviting me to be a part of this. It's a privilege and an honor. Like a pulse oximeter, really bulky pulse oximeter, because it was like this big back in the 90s. And playing with those things and kind of talking to her about her work. But I was also a bit of an accident-prone child. So I had a number of fractures as a kid. Ended up in the ER and around medicine. And so my dad actually has spent his whole life in textiles and is very mechanically minded. My mom was in medicine. And then since I'm at the tail end of my family, being second youngest, my oldest brother is actually a physician as well, but he's about 10 years older than I am. So I started to see kind of what medicine was like through his experience growing up as he went to medical school and residency and so forth. So that's kind of how I got interested in medicine. But what really drew me into medicine and what inspired me to pursue a career in medicine was really kind of a combination of really just wanting to help people in a really practical way to serve people's needs. There's also an element of my faith and wanting to know what it meant to really tangibly love your neighbor and work that out. And then also I've always enjoyed kind of more intellectual challenges and that I don't know, like problem solving element that's in medicine was really appealing to me as well. So I would say all those things together brought me into medicine. If you'd asked me in high school what I was going to do, I would have said maybe medicine, and I wasn't quite sure. But really what kind of sealed it for me was in college, as I was kind of beginning on a course towards medicine, I got a job in a local operating room. Really as the guy that, like, quite literally, there's no joke, I was the guy that mopped the floor after surgery. These are like orthopedic surgeries, a lot of them. And so I mopped the floor and I would clean up bone fragments off the floor and would move the patients around. And I just found that I really enjoyed being there, actually. Though I also realized I never wanted to be a surgeon. So that was kind of like my process of getting in. But once I had that experience and realized that I really enjoyed it and really started to enjoy the material and the background I had, I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And I've just found all along that when I practice medicine, that I have this sense that I'm engaging in something that almost feels like I was made to do it, like that like it brings together the diversity of talents and skills I have and my passions.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, it's interesting because it's such a long path.
Mm-hmm.
It takes time to become a doctor, and during that process, you one might feel that I mean you face a lot of challenges and there's a lot of doubt, but then it's also so rewarding when you reach that point of actually applying everything you learn and feeling that it was meant to be. So,
yeah, and I think one of the things that goes with that is because it is so long and hard, and the educational process in itself is not just like intellectually trying, but physically very trying at times, right? Like with call shifts and everything, that you can feel very depleted and lose elements of that passion and the real enjoyment of what brought you into medicine, and that focus on people, to where the people can become the problem instead of kind of part of the pleasure of it. And I think that's always a challenge. So I would never want to give the impression that every day feels like, this dream of practicing medicine. At its best times it feels that way. But I mean, even today, like I had clinic all day, and it was filled with challenges, and I felt very depleted at the end of the day. And yeah, it's hard. Like it's work, but it still can be good.
Yeah, lifelong learning.
Yes. Yeah.
So, what will you say are the characteristics that make up a good doctor, in your opinion?
Yeah. Um, that's such a big question, right? Um, I wrote down a list actually, kind of thinking through this before. And I think it's easy probably to go off and just start listing things because there's so many things, but maybe to focus in on a few would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think, to me, one of the things that I've really tried to prioritize in my own practice is an awareness that I'm just as frail and broken and human as the person across from me. Uh, I had a patient today, for instance, who came to see me, and she has a long history of struggling with a diagnosis and being felt that she's been labeled a hypochondriac. And I could actually like visibly see her shaking, like with anxiety, like as she relayed to me her story and kind of all that she's been through and her kind of disappointments and not being able to get a diagnosis, but also her kind of coming to terms with the fact that maybe there isn't going to be one. Um, and I think in moments like that, as a doctor, the answer is not for me to look at her and tell her that I'm going to fix everything, because I can't, right? Like, I mean, it's probably very unrealistic for me to do that. But what I can do is I can look at her and tell her like, hey, like I want you to know that I see you, like where you're at, that I'm no different than you, and that we can walk together through this and share this experience of what it means to be human in this world that's filled with disease and illness, and but also with hope, and do it together. So I think to me that's one of the chief things about being a physician is just living in that shared humanity, and embracing it as part of your practice. And I think with that, it's just practicing the self-awareness of your own weakness, your own biases, your own ignorance, your own capacity for error, but also like your own strengths, kind of what you're bringing to this relationship and how you can serve this patient, like your training that you have, the people that have invested in you, your knowledge, and the skill set that you can use to really tangibly love and serve this other person. And hand in hand with those things, I would add this element of, just this embrace of suffering as part of the human experience, and being willing to enter into suffering with patients, as part of their experience of illness, but also part of finding healing. There's just something I think really powerful about doing that with patients, about meeting them where they're at in their illness, that can provide a means of healing and encouragement and I don't know, like of solidarity, maybe is the word I'm looking for, um, that that strikes against the kind of isolation and loneliness and hopelessness that illness can create.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
this was
that's
a real, if this wasn't like a written out conversation, I would be like, what are your thoughts now?
I mean, I that resonates with me a lot, but I also think that it's so challenging to cultivate that,
Yeah.
you know, because of the culture of medicine, and also, you know, this positive feedback that we get from being physicians, and the status that goes along with that. So on our previous episode, Jeff Milstein, he talked about humility as well, which I thought was, you know, also like a very thoughtful way of putting it.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, and I think it gets to the same idea, right? Like the idea of humility is rooted in our earthiness, right? Like it comes from the same root as humus, like which is another word for earth, right?
Yeah.
It's that again that shared nature, like of being dust and being frail, and being aware of that. Um, I think to your point though about kind of education not necessarily facilitating that. I think there is this. I think we struggle with endeavors where sorrow is like a big component of what we do, right? I like on a separate tangent, but related. Like about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I reread The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is like a prelude to Lord of the Rings, kind of explains the background. And just in reading through those stories, I was struck by how prominent sorrow is a theme, like in so many of his stories that he tells in there and in Lord of the Rings. And yet how foundational it is to like the sense of hope and the kind of arc of I can't think of the right word. I want to say like arc of hope or arc of kind of redemption, even in a way, like of the narrative, like that you can acknowledge the sorrow of the world, but also live in the hope of it at the same time. And I think really medicine is a lot about that. Like at the end of the day, like to be able to embrace the sorrow, but also have the hope there with the patient.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, you know, it takes time to discover this human dimension of medicine. I think that it takes, you know, practice, and you know, living the experience of standing in front of the patient, and you know, you know, having the responsibility of you know, providing answers, and caring for them, and you know, helping them solve some of the problems that they're facing. I also curious to know about you know, who are the, or what mentors did you have at different stages in your professional journey, and how maybe um, uh, some of these mentors help you find these you know, these answers.
Yeah. Man, so I was thinking about this and I've thought about this question of mentorship many times over the last several years because I think I would say that looking back on my life up to this point, I've had a series of mentors that have just been really gracious and kind, and it goes all the way back to high school, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that's shocking to me about it and somewhat surprising is that it wasn't that I necessarily feel like I was really intentional about that. Um, it's more that there were just people around me who were willing to take the time to invest in me, and in relationships developed, and that went on. So um, So I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. Like I have a 9-year-old, a almost 5-year-old, and a 15-month-old. And one of the things I've tried to teach them again and again, because of my own experience in medicine, is just the importance of learning to fail. And I think for me, that's one of the big lessons I've learned from mentors along the way. Even though I don't think that was sometimes what they were trying to teach me. And so like some of my first big failures came in high school, like competing in speech and debate, and getting to like a final round, where it was just me and one other person, and then just kind of blowing it, and having to say like, okay, well, like how do I evaluate myself like in this? Am I just a failure, or is this just part of growing? Um, and so I had some really great speech and debate teachers in high school that were mentors, who saw those experiences and knew about those failures, and yet also it's not like they gave up on me. They continued to cultivate me and to help me grow, and that led to successes that I think wouldn't have happened otherwise. And I think I was kind of blind to it a lot, actually, because in my mind it was more just like, yeah, I had a failure, but like this is just something fun I'm doing. Like I just want to keep trying. Um, and so it started in high school. I had those mentors in college. Um, Actually, the chair of my biology department was a guy who just really cared about his students. He still does deeply. And he actually, on the first day of class, would have everybody go around in like the big general biology classroom, and he would video record everybody saying their name, and then use that video to memorize everybody's name in the classroom.
Yeah.
Because that's just the kind of person he is. And so he was a mentor as well, and still is a friend, and really was passionate about making sure that when it came to learning science, that it wasn't just about memorizing, but it was really about learning to think critically, and really laid just a great foundation for that practice going into medicine for me. But on a personal level, was also somebody who I knew I could go to with any question, and was willing to be there for me. Also in college, I went through some really tough personal times, and there was actually a pastor that is a close friend who also became a really good mentor. And I think in him, I learned more of kind of that passion for seeing the human across from you, the other person, and for also just thinking creatively about what are the ways we can really kind of love and serve other people that maybe we're missing out on right now. And I spent a lot of time with him, and doing that alongside him at different times, and just hearing kind of how his mind worked, and seeing how he thinks. I think anytime you have a mentor, what I've learned is really what I want to understand from that person is like, how do you think? Like what drives you? And like, I want to understand, like, how do you like put your ideas together and your thoughts together? I think it's especially true when you have like an attending that's a mentor. Because I remember like other mentors I've had are like chiefs of service that I worked with during residency. Like I think people like James Cooper, who was my chief during intern year, or Michelle Sharp, Sarah Raju, those were other chiefs I had as a senior. And I have distinct memories of just like listening to them and seeing them reason in front of me, and them doing it in this kind of open, vulnerable way to share their thoughts, and just being like, I want to learn to do that. Like I want to understand how you think and get inside your head. And so that was great too. And then kind of more recently, from a research perspective, Craig Pollack has been my primary research mentor and has been really gracious and just kind and in spending time with me, investing in me. And then also people like David Levine, who's like the grandfather of my division at Hopkins, and a really well-known person in community-based research, have all been great. There's been so many along the way. And then I would also add like my dad too, actually, like, because my dad is just a guy who, like I said, he worked in textiles, and in the area I grew up in, that was a dying industry. And so it meant that often he was working away from home for long hours. And yet he really did it in a way that he was seeking to prioritize his family and like provide for us and everything. And like I think he probably still has grease stains on his hands from like 20 years ago, you know, like
Yeah.
like it's because that's just the kind of guy he is. Like he's always working. And really I think taught me a lot about work indirectly, like through just the way he pursued his own work as a way of serving his family.
What do you think makes a good mentor?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to a good mentor, what I look for and what I've benefited from are people who provide structure and guidance to succeed, but who also give me that freedom to fail.
Yeah.
Because like you need that space to make mistakes, right? And it can be frustrating, right? Because I think sometimes we think their job is to protect us from making mistakes. And I think there's a certain level of that, like some measure of it. But there's also just this kind of fact that you're not going to develop or grow in the way you need to unless you have those mistakes. And in medicine, we try to be really careful from a clinical standpoint in providing the room for that failure to ensure patients stay safe. But it's so much better to fail when you have a mentor, like, and you have that protection than you know when you're out on your own and you're facing that failure and you have no buffer, like, and you just have to deal with the pieces of your failure more on your own, right? Like, so I think a good mentor is somebody who is going to do that. It's also going to be someone though who's going to, you know, feel responsible for you, but isn't going to feel entirely responsible for you in a way that they're controlling, or that they feel like, you know, you are a direct reflection of them, so that they need to make sure everything works out. You want them to anticipate challenges for you while also, you know, just not trying to direct everything, which is always a balance with any kind of learner that you have.
Yeah.
And challenges. And then lastly, I would say, like, I think it's important to think too about what a good mentor is not. Like a good mentor is not somebody who's trying to make you like them. Like it's not somebody who's trying to recreate themselves in you. I think that can be a pitfall that we all are prone to fall into, where we think that our job as mentors or our job as mentees even is just to kind of create little replicas. But that is really the opposite of mentoring. That is not helpful.
Have you had the experience of mentoring someone?
I would say, you know, it's an area I'm growing in. I would say that yes, like there are ways in which I've mentored people, though with where I'm at, you know, as junior faculty coming on, it's just starting to be more of my career. So I think the person that comes most to mind is a research assistant I have, who just finished a master's degree from the School of Public Health and is now going on to do a PhD. And she's been a phenomenal research assistant on some of the research I've been able to do. And it's just been this very natural kind of conversation of trying to understand what her interests are, like how can I help her, you know, and trying to give her more responsibility over time to do some of the things that she wants to do to continue to grow and develop.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I also wanted to ask you about so you I know that because of your research and you know your work in West Baltimore, you have been you know cultivating relationships with the community.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how the community can also play like a mentoring role in our development as physicians. Yeah, I was just curious about that because of your experience and your interest in that area.
Can I just ask a clarification question? I feel like the word community is often a word that people mean different things by.
Yeah.
So I want to understand what you mean by community, just to make sure I answer the question that you're asking.
So in this case, I mean your community of peers, the medical community, and how you know we can help each other become better doctors.
Okay.
I was curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So you're talking more about the professional community, not the
Yeah.
like local community I live in. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think probably the first thing I would say is kind of cultivating within yourself a transparency and vulnerability that is genuine. I'm not talking about online vulnerability or transparency. Like I think that's often I'm critical of that sometimes. But I mean like a genuine kind of like peer-to-peer relational vulnerability, transparency of relationship with the people you work with on a day in and day out way, where you're able to go to them and say like, hey, I'm really struggling with this, or like, hey, I'm not sure what to do about this patient, or hey, this is what I did and I'm not sure it was the right thing. So that you're modeling to people the fact that the learning process that began during residency and medical school and college and everything hasn't stopped, right? So I think the first, one of the not necessarily the first, but one of the big mistakes we make coming on as faculty, and I feel this temptation now, is to think that we have to have it all together,
Yeah.
um, and to think that we need to somehow be islands unto ourselves when it comes to solving problems. And I find that when I'm tempted to think that, like I start thinking about the doctors that I know that I respect as really good doctors, I ask myself like, well, what would this person do? And then I can usually think of a situation where I actually know how that person responded to a similar situation, and it usually involved going to somebody else and practicing that kind of vulnerability. And so, on a communal level, we have to be willing to exercise that. I think there also just needs to be a genuine willingness to listen with each other, and to not make it our reflex to compare ourselves with each other, but to make it our reflex to listen and think about how can I help, how can I serve this other person, and actually learn from the situation myself, like how can they be serving me through this, because like I also need that development. And so practicing that listening without kind of jumping to an attitude of comparing, or using it as some way of thinking differently about yourself in terms of making yourself feel better or whatever, but really being present for that other person. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, again, when it comes back to my own experience, I benefit the most when I'm actively sharing things I'm working on or situations I'm facing with other people. That's actually why COVID has been really hard for me in some ways. Like I like to be collaborative. Like I work best in a collaborative setting, and sticking me in an office like for 8 hours a day, like where there's no other people and it's just me and a computer and these digitally mediated relationships, like, oh, it's so stifling, because like I want to be in a room and I want to argue with people, like, like give me somebody that I can have like a real discussion with, and we can see our faces get maybe a little red or blush a little bit, or like, that like, or we can feel some of those emotions and what it means to be human in somebody else's presence, right? And working through things, like, but to just have the kind of numbness of being in a room by yourself all day, like, I don't want that. Like that's painful.
Yeah. That's a whole different story.
Yeah. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that answers your question, but yeah, like, I mean, you've got to have that sense of community, that vulnerability, that willingness to share and to give and take, and to put yourself out there. And if you want that from others, you've got to be willing to do it yourself. And I think modeling it is a big part of building a community that does it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the need of or this idea of vulnerability a couple of times now, and it's a relevant topic. It's something that we actually in the Ars Medica online community, we have been exploring the topic of vulnerability over the past month, and I was curious to know what are your thoughts about ways in which we can make a space for vulnerability in medicine, and maybe some of the barriers that we encounter to do that?
Sorry, I'm a pediatrician. That's my son's potty watch going off. So we'll take care of that. But the uh, the question about vulnerability, like spaces we can make to deal with vulnerability,
Yeah.
or to practice vulnerability. Oh man, I think this wasn't in your pre-submitted questions. I'm just giving you a hard time. I think one of the biggest challenges in medicine to being vulnerable are, is one that the professionalization, right, of our profession, right? That like there needs to be this expert, right? And this understanding of what you think an expert is or isn't, right? Um, and this feeling of, well, I need to be this expert with the answers. And and sometimes that's even like, part of your promotional track, right? Like if you're gonna go up the ladder, from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, right?
Yeah.
And everything, you need to prove certain things, right? And I think that culture of that process can create a culture, it doesn't have to, where that need to prove yourself creates an insulated environment where you're not willing to practice vulnerability out of a fear that in so doing you may somehow disprove yourself. And while that's not true, like I don't feel like that's true in my work environment. I feel like I'm free to do that. I think there still are some situations though where like um, there's not necessarily, it's important that leadership is making that clear that that's a value, and that it's a non-negotiable, right? Like this is not an option, right? Like any educational environment, like there needs to be a freedom to be vulnerable if we're going to learn, and if we're along with that idea. And I certainly, so like I'm a guy from South Carolina. That's where I grew up. Like I came to Baltimore. I'm not from here, right? Like I come from a distinct place with a distinct culture, with a distinct background, right? None of those things I chose. I'm really thick group culture of academics that all think the same way and all value the same thing. And um, it doesn't honor our respective backgrounds that we come from. And I think it also, in so doing, impedes vulnerability. So I think honestly, just getting to know your colleagues, like,
Yeah.
and asking what may seem like obvious questions, like, like, what do you care about? Like, what drives your passion? Like, tell me about your background growing up. Like, yeah, I mean, those are important things, but I feel like we miss a lot of that in our day-to-day relationships with our colleagues because we just jump to the work issue.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the idea of creating space to, be spontaneous and to get to know each other and talk about maybe personal stuff also.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just space though. Like there's also like, I think that's a component of it, but I think it's a sense of acknowledging like our humanity in a way that recognizes that we're all going to be different and we're all going to come from different communities, like in a sense. And we shouldn't expect that we're all going to think the same or have the same values. And recognizing the humanity in the other person is going to mean that I take time to learn those things from them and what is important to them. So
no, I appreciate that. So as a final question, Daniel, what are some of the things that now that you would have wanted to know at the beginning of your career?
Yeah. I think I would go back some to what I said earlier about the lesson about failure. We had this saying on the medicine service when I was a resident that it was the job of the intern to fail. Literally, that's your job, like to make mistakes and to learn from them. And it took me a long time to learn that and feel comfortable with it. And I wish somebody would have taught me that a lot sooner. I started to kind of sense it during medical school because I started to realize I would use language to hide what I didn't know. And like as a medical student, you get really good at learning ways to protect your vulnerability, right? Like you learn that if I ask a question, then somebody won't ask me a question, right? And so it becomes this game, right? Like, or maybe if I speak up and volunteer information, then I won't get probed for information. Um, and you start to build these unhealthy habits actually that make you maybe feel more secure, but don't make you a better doctor, and don't actually help you learn. And some of the best medical students I've had actually are medical students who are totally comfortable asking any question and just exposing that they don't know a lot of things. And I wish somebody had told me that earlier. I think something that I'm kind of working through personally right now and trying to understand more, but that I wish I had spent more time thinking about earlier is actually a quote from an author named Wendell Berry. Have you read any Wendell Berry? Do you know him at all?
I've heard of him, but I haven't read any of his work.
Yeah, so I think you really enjoy probably reading his essay like Health is Membership. But it's a 25-year anniversary of that essay, kind of him delivering it as a speech. And so I've been thinking about it some lately because I read it a few years ago. And one of the things he says in there is that the smallest unit of health is the community. And I think there's something really profound and also needed about that statement in our time and place, because we're so used to thinking of health in terms of the individual. Yeah. And as we're developing what we think of as precision medicine on the individual level, I'm just starting to wonder more and more, are we actually drifting away from what health really is? Barry has a lot of reasons for why he says the smallest unit of health is the community. But I wish somebody had come to me with that earlier to think more about how that framework would affect my practice of medicine and also just how I view my practice of community itself, as I try to seek health both for myself, but also for the people around me, my neighbors. It's something that I'm working through now, but I wish I'd thought about a lot earlier.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's really interesting. Well, there's a lot to think about after this conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Daniel. It was a real pleasure. And I want to thank also our audience, and will tell you that this event was brought to you by Ars Medica. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to nurturing the personal and professional growth of medical students and physicians. Our online community brings together doctors, residents, and medical students to inspire and support each other in our journey towards a meaningful practice of medicine. If you want to join our community, you can go to our website. That's ars-medica.org, ars-medica.org, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you, Daniel, and until next time.
Thanks, Javier. It's my pleasure.
It was nice to see you.
You too. Take care.
You too. Bye.